Hello and welcome back to Economics with Professor Kline at Cuesta College. The topic of today's video is the circular flow model. All right, so there's two pieces to understand before we put this model together. And the two pieces to understand are our economic resources and then also our economic decision-making groups. And so then we will put them together and talk about how these come together and exchange with each other to create our economy. So economic resources, we have three. Some textbooks have a fourth one, and I'll mention what that is. The first one is land, right? And that can actually be expanded on for the definition. And so some people say natural resources. And so it's anything that comes from the land. Right? So it can be water, it can be silica, copper, gold, platinum, all these other things that come from the land, as well as, land itself, right? You rent a space to build a building, etc. The second one is labor, right? So labor, that's the human effort. This is not the same as human capital, though they are related. Human capital makes our labor more productive. That's knowledge, skills, education that make our labor more productive. So that's a slightly different definition. But labor is just simply our human effort. And then the third is physical capital. Sometimes people only refer to this as capital. Okay. And so the way that I remember this is LLC, which is also one of the most common structures for businesses, limited liability corporation. So LLC, land, labor, capital, you'll hear me say that. So physical capital, if you're not familiar with this term, these are really all the things that you could consider infrastructure, right? So infrastructure are our roads, our bridges, our airports, our seaports, right? It's also our electrical grid. All of that is physical capital. Buildings, machinery, those are all parts of physical capital, right? And so I mentioned some textbooks actually include a fourth. And so the fourth is then often entrepreneurial ability, right? And so the idea behind entrepreneurial ability is that land sits there unused, labor sits there unused, nobody buys capital until somebody comes along and says, hey, I have a great idea. Let's use this type of land and these natural resources, and let's hire these people, and let's build this building, and let's create something, right? And so that's basically the idea behind entrepreneurial ability, is just bringing these together to produce something new. So then we also have our economic decision-making groups, of which you are a part of at least one, right? And so the first one that we have that is the largest in sheer number is households, right? Why is it not just individuals? Well, we classify people into households because often households have decisions that they make together, right? So for instance, if you're part of a family, or even if you are sharing an apartment with a roommate, right, you're probably going to make the decision together of who your internet service provider is going to be and have one provider and split the bill, rather than having multiple providers provide service that you can share, right? So there are some decisions that households make together. The second are firms. And so for those books that don't include the entrepreneurial ability, that's because we're kind of including that information over here in firms. And so these are all the organizations that come together that produce things, right? And so occasionally households will also come into being firms. It's different. There's different decision making going on when you're part of a household versus when you're part of a firm, right? And so in the very least, everyone is part of a household. They may or may not be part of a firm. And then the third one is the government. Now, the government is particularly important. And I've said this before, and I don't know how true it is, but I think a really well-functioning government is one that almost nobody really notices, right? But here's the role of government, and it is very important, right? You actually don't have an economy without a functioning government. The role of the government is to create and enforce rules. right? And rules come in many different forms: laws, regulations, etc., executive orders. So governments create and enforce rules. One of the biggest things that governments do is enforce contracts, right? So firms, when they engage with each other, they almost always create a contract. And that's why it's really important to take business law for any business major, anyone looking to go into business, because those contracts, there are times when even a verbal contract, even if it's not written down, can be binding, right? And I'm not going to teach you all about that. Take your business law class for that, right? So there are contracts that are created. Well, right, contract is two parties who have both agreed to do something else. That's going to be trade, that we talked about with the 5 foundations. And so the problem is, well, what happens if one party breaks their contract? This is where the government comes in. The government is there to then enforce the contract, right? Hopefully the contract was written clearly enough to say what happens if one party does not fulfill their portion of the contract, right? And so that's essentially what the government is here to do. And so really it's the judicial system that is one of the most important parts of our government as far as allowing markets to exist, right? They create the framework in which our markets exist. Without it, there is no trust, there is no reason to expect a contract to be enforced, and therefore trade breaks down. This is one of the things that we talk about with economic growth. We need a stable rule of law. All right, so we have government, and then we end up kind of just repeating this for the rest of the world, right? Because everyone, as I mentioned, is a part of a household. So why are we repeating it for the rest of the world? Well, again, the government plays a very important part. And so the US government has its own set of rules and regulations that is not the same, right? It can be very similar to other countries, but it's never going to be the same as other countries. So for China, there's a big question between the US and China about intellectual property and whether or not they're going to enforce our rules with that, right? And that becomes very difficult because one of the things that is very difficult is having an international court, right? Which set of laws, because we don't have international laws, which set of laws do you enforce? And so we say the rest of the world because essentially households and firms are going to play by the set of rules determined by their government. Right? And so this is what changes from one country to the next. It's the creation and the enforcement of those rules. All right. So when we put this all together, this is where we get to the circular flow. Right? And so I'm going to put households on one end and firms on the other. And then households are going to provide resources, right? So households provide the resources, the land, the labor, and the capital. Particularly the labor is the easiest to identify here, right? Households provide labor, the firms buy that labor, and then we're going to talk about what do they give households, right? And again, money is much like the term tool. It's not very specific. So in economics, we want to replace the term money with a more specific term each time. So when firms pay for land, it's called rent, right? When firms pay for our labor, it's called wages. And when firms pay for capital, we call it interest. Now that one might seem a little odd, and let me explain that one here. Why is it we're paying interest for capital? Well, let's say that we need to borrow $100 million because we are going to build a new gigafactory in the middle of Nevada. There's two ways that we can get that $100 million, right? One way is to borrow it. If we borrow $100 million and we build that gigafactory, what do I have to pay on the loan for the $100 million? Interest. What if I have $100 million? Then clearly I'm not paying interest. Aha, the key of opportunity cost. You are paying interest because you could have put that money to work elsewhere, so you are missing out on interest, right? So for land, we pay rent. Think of a landlord, you pay rent to a landlord. For labor, we pay wages. And for capital, we pay interest. So then what do firms do with these resources, right? This is the resource market. Well, they take these resources and they turn them into products. They produce something. And so we often think of goods and services, right? So firms produce goods and services for the households, right? So here are those goods and services. So what do firms get for goods and services? Well, we have to be careful here and really think about this for just a moment, right? What firms get is going to be after what they've paid for resources. So think of everything the firm earns, that would be revenue, and subtract the costs, right? The input costs, the resource costs, and what are you left with? The answer is profit, right? So after they've paid for these resources, what they earn for doing a good job of making products is they earn a profit, right? And so this is actually one way that we could calculate GDP. It's called the income approach, where we could look at wages, interest, rent, and profit, right? We're actually going to find that income is the hardest way to account for GDP, partially because we have a really difficult tax system, partially due to other issues. So we're going to more likely focus on who spent the money, and that's when it comes back to economic decision-making groups. Households consume, businesses invest, and we'll talk about how that term is different, investment, and then we're going to have government spending, and then net exports, which represents the rest of the world. So here's our circular flow model. This is the way we interact. And then notice the government is not listed here, but again, the government has regulations about both of these interactions, right? There's some consumer protections so that, if you have a bakery, they have to come in and do inspections to make sure that you're not selling poisonous food, right? That you're following all the protocols. Anyone working, right? There's OSHA to make sure that you're working in a safe environment. There's environmental regulations for how the land can be used and in which zones, right? And so and then of course the financial markets, there's ways of how you can raise that capital. You can't put out an incorrect prospectus. So all of these things are governed by rules and regulations. So government, as I mentioned, kind of the best one should be, we don't really see it, but it's here making this work, right? Making this so that we don't want to stop giving our land, labor, or capital for firms, and making sure that the firms are producing goods and services that are not making our household sick, et cetera, right? So it's a mutually beneficial system where we are trading both of them, again, to make us all better off. So I hope that was helpful. I'll see you next time. Have a good one.